Mr. Ghost by Head of Spectre. In the spring of 1953, when I was 9 years old, I saw my brother die. I'll remember that day for the rest of my life. The memory has never left me, and it never will. Part of it is the trauma, the slow, insidious realization that he was gone that crept into my life afterwards. But there is more to it than that I don't talk about. I've held on to it for years, and I don't want to hold on to it any longer. It was the 10th of April. School had just finished, and Charlie and I were walking home like we always did. Those were good times. Mom always had a snack waiting for us. Good old cookies and milk. American staple, American standby. Charlie was the kind of kid with a smile that could light up a room. He was a year above me, but he seemed to be full of more energy than I could have ever mustered. Outside, we'd play superheroes, like the ones in comic books. He was always Captain America. I was always Bucky Barnes. With wild ginger hair, freckles, and sparkling green eyes, he didn't look much of a superhero, but he sure knew the part well. After our snack, he'd grab the garbage can lid, I'd grab my BB gun, and we'd go out and fight the bad guys on the front lawn. We'd been hoping to play like that when I'd got home, and Charlie was ahead of me, looking back and yelling for me to keep up. "Come on, Felix, Mom's waiting." I remember the smile on his face. I also remember seeing that green 1953 Chevy Corvette round the corner behind him and come barreling down the road. For a moment, I didn't think much of it. Why should I have? The Corvette should have passed us by with no issue. Sure, he was going a little fast, but that should have been nothing to worry about. Charlie turned to look around as he heard the scream of rubber on the asphalt. I can only imagine he was admiring the Corvette. We used to think they were the coolest cars. When I heard the bang of the tire, I didn't know what it was at first. The plume of debris was a little shocking, and it distracted me just long enough to realize that the Corvette was headed our way. I caught the glimpse of the driver's face, which had frozen into a panicked look as he tried to regain control of his car. Charlie didn't even have time to move. The Corvette jumped the curb, hitting him head-on. He was thrown back like one of his toys, and the Corvette went over the sidewalk and down the shallow ditch beside us, burying him beneath it. I had felt nothing but the wind as it sailed past me, and heard nothing but the scrape of metal. Tossing my backpack to the ground, I ran to the wrecked car and tended my brother. I could still see his face contorted into a mask of agony. The Corvette was crushing his lower half, and you could tell he was in pain from his screams. Those screams still haunt me today. I was unable to speak. His pained howls made speaking almost useless. I stole a glance inside the sports Corvette. The windshield was cracked, and I saw blood. The driver wouldn't be helping us anytime soon. "Felix." I could hear his voice, fragile, pained. "Help, please." The tears streamed down his cheeks, and I didn't want to leave him, but I knew there was no choice. I ran back up to the side of the road and looked for a passing car, somebody to help us. Anybody. Only moments ago there had been other cars on the street, but now everybody was gone. The world seemed dimmer. The sunlight seemed to be cutting through a thick fog that had not been there before. There was no sound other than Charlie's screams, which quickly subsided into whimpers. I looked around frantically. In the distance, I could see a figure in the fog. I waved at him and yelled, "Hey, mister, we need help, please!" The figure in the distance didn't come any closer or any faster. I called out for him again, waving my arms to grab his attention. "Sir, please, come fast, we need help!" I looked down at Charlie. He was so horribly pale, his hands on the grill of the crashed Corvette that pinned him. From behind me, I heard a high and squeaky voice. "Well, ain't that a little bit of a predicament?" I jumped and looked in the direction of the voice. It was the man from the distance. How he had gotten here so fast by just walking. Had he run towards us when I wasn't looking? He was dressed all in black. A heavy black coat, black fedora, and black leather gloves. He looked like a businessman on his way home from work. "Sir," I said, my voice shaking, "please, we need to call someone. A hospital, something." The man laughed. It was such a carefree sound, and it filled me with rage. How could he laugh at a moment like this? "My dear boy, a hospital won't save your friend now. Oh no, I'm afraid he is a little too injured for that." "What do you mean?" I asked, panicked. "Well, your friend is going to die, I'm afraid," the man said. "But that's why I'm here." He extended a gloved hand toward me. I didn't shake it. All I could do was stare. When I didn't move, he patted my shoulder and brushed past me, making his way down to the ditch toward the car, moving casually, as if Charlie's cries for help meant nothing to him. I didn't have the capacity to speak, trying to process all that he had said. I wasn't sure if this man was insane or sincere. He knelt down beside my brother, his smile carefree and infectious. "Don't worry, dear boy," he said, caressing Charlie's forehead. And just like that, he stopped his tormented shrieks. His body went limp, and he let out almost a relaxed sigh. There. Let's get you out of this awful place." The man grabbed Charlie by his arms and gave him a sharp pull. I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could say anything, the deed was done. Charlie had been pulled out from under the car in one piece, and he was standing like nothing had happened. I called his name and reached out to hug him, but the man stood between us, blocking my way. "I can't allow that," he warned me. "I'm sorry." Why not?" I begged, and his expression turned solemn. "You aren't supposed to be here. My work isn't exactly for prying eyes. But here you are all the same. Don't question that way of it. Sometimes these things just are, and there is a purpose in everything. Besides, I don't really mind the company, but I can't allow you to touch him. He is no longer of your world." Charlie didn't say anything to me. He didn't even look at me. His eyes had a dead, ignorant look to them. The man brushed past me and opened the door of the fallen car. He thrust his hand in and pulled the driver from his seat. He was only a teenager, but I was horrified when I saw him. The neck was bent at an impossible angle. I could see the bones pressed against the skin. His neck had to have been broken. He shouldn't have been alive. The man remained indifferent to the seemingly fatal wound on the driver and simply placed his hands on his cheeks and with a sudden movement jerked his head back into place. There was a sickening crack. "All the better," he said sweetly and looked at me. What happens to me?" I asked. He said that Charlie was going to die, and the driver was clearly dead too. But then, if I was seeing him, was I also dead? Was he going to hurt me for seeing him, whatever exactly he was? "Oh, I'm not going to hurt you. And you're very much alive, Felix," he said, and offered a warm smile. I hadn't said anything to him. How did he know what I was thinking? I was too stunned to speak. "Very rarely do humans see me. They don't want to see me, and what I do." "What do you do?" I asked. My voice was shaking. It was just one of a million questions I had. "Well, I'm something of a chauffeur," he said. "I pick people up and drop them off. I'll be picking you up one day, too." How do you know my name?" He didn't reply. He smiled and took the hands of both Charlie and the teenage driver. "Don't you worry about that. That won't be for a while, but for now I've got to run. I'm a very busy man, you know." With that, he led both Charlie and the driver back to the road. A black car was waiting there. It hadn't been there before. An older model that later in life I'd recognize as a 1935 Duesenberg convertible. He put Charlie and the driver into the back seat before climbing behind the wheel himself. The last I saw of him was a friendly wave he gave me before he drove off. That was it. I sat down on the grass, my back to the car, and started to cry. I looked down at where Charlie had been, and to my surprise, he was still there. But he wasn't screaming. He wasn't even moving. He lay there pinned beneath the vehicle, with his eyes staring vacantly up into the sky. I was still in the ditch when the police came, and when they took Charlie away. I remember watching them take the driver of the car, too. His neck was broken the exact same way it had been when the man had taken him out earlier. But nobody just cracked his head back into place. The wound had been as fatal as I thought. I had no idea what I'd witnessed until much later. Even today, I'm still not sure. Every now and then, I'll be driving down the road and I'll see a car accident. Parked right beside the police cars is a black Duesenberg convertible. I don't think anybody else sees it. Once I saw the same gaunt man and I swore he looked at me and winked. I've taken to referring to him as Mr. Ghost. It's the only name that seems to fit the man. On the streets, sometimes I'll see the car driving past, Mr. Ghost's car. I assume he's on his way to other business. People are always dying, you know. I learned a lot about the world that day, maybe more than most people know. I learned about the methods of death. But every day I wake up, I'm thankful not to see him standing over my bed, hand extended, carefree grin on his face. I know it's going to happen to me one day. I just hope I'm ready when it does. I was tucking my little sister into bed when she spoke up. "Can you sit with me until I fall asleep?" "Why?" I asked. "I thought you weren't afraid of the dark." "It's not the dark," Charlotte said. "It's the Twisted Lady." A chill shot down my spine. "Who?" "The Twisted Lady," my sister repeated. "She comes into my room and watches me as I sleep." Wordlessly, I lay down beside Charlotte and held her close. She fell asleep within minutes, but I stared up at the dark ceiling and tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. The Twisted Lady. I knew that name. When I was 3, I used to talk about a gnarled-looking woman who lived in the basement and only came out at night. I described her as having white eyes and a face like a skeleton. My parents assumed it was just a recurring nightmare and got a nightlight for my room. That seemed to help, and I grew up believing the Twisted Lady had been nothing more than a construct of my imagination. But now, 15 years later, my 7-year-old sister had seen her too. I stayed up with Charlotte all night, my sleep restless and uneasy. The next morning, I asked my mom if she told my sister about the Twisted Lady. "No, of course not. I wouldn't want to scare her." "Well, she was talking about her last night, though." "She must have overheard us discussing it." Mom's lips thinned with worry. "Oh, dear. I hope she doesn't start having nightmares like you did." That day, I could barely concentrate in school. I kept sifting through my memories, trying to find an image of the Twisted Lady. I was unsuccessful. When I got home, I searched the internet for clues, but nothing solid came up. All too soon, night rolled around again, and I stood outside Charlotte's door, listening to her speak with Mom. "The Twisted Lady will come. Honey, there's no such thing as a Twisted Lady. Trust me, you're completely safe." "She's real, Mama," Charlotte insisted. The desperation in her voice brought stinging tears to my eyes. "She really is. Honey, go to sleep, okay? It's going to be okay, I promise." She kissed my sister and walked out of the room. When she saw me standing in the hall, she gave me a reassuring smile and said, "Everything's okay." But it wasn't. Charlotte woke up that night, screaming. "She was in here," she wailed when I burst into a room, my parents shadowing me. "The Twisted Lady was in here." I picked her up and rocked her. "It's okay, sweetie. You're safe with us." She sobbed as our parents came over and wrapped their arms around us both. We sat there hugging until Charlotte dozed off again. After tucking her back in, we went to bed. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. And that was just the beginning. A pattern emerged over the next 2 months. At least one night a week, Charlotte would scream out at night and insist that the Twisted Lady had been in her room. We would calm her and she would go back to sleep, only for it to happen again, a night or two later next week. Soon the physical effects of the nightmares became apparent. Plum-colored circles formed around Charlotte's pretty blue eyes. Her face was perpetually as pale as unbaked bread dough, and she moved as if her legs were too heavy for the rest of her body. She could barely stay awake, and we were all worried that she was only going to get worse. I still wasn't sure if I believed whether or not the Twisted Lady was real. I'm not really a skeptic, but I'd rather rule out all rational explanations before believing that there are paranormal forces at work. Also, I was afraid. I couldn't remember the Twisted Lady herself, but I did remember the terror she planted in me. A terror that seemed never to have left us after all. One night, on a weekend my parents were out of town, I came up with a plan. What if I could get physical proof that the Twisted Lady wasn't real? If Charlotte saw it herself, maybe the nightmares would stop. If she knew the Twisted Lady wasn't real, she wouldn't have to be afraid. I set up my father's camcorder in Charlotte's room, explaining to her that if the Twisted Lady came by, the device would pick her up. I then took my baby sister into my own room, and we crawled into bed and fell asleep. I woke up extremely early, just as the sun began to bleed through the hazy lavender sky. Rubbing my eyes, I stumbled into the hall, and my heart flew into my throat when I saw that Charlotte's door was open. I was sure I'd closed it the night before. Moving as quietly as I could in my slightly panicked state, I grabbed the camcorder and went downstairs to the living room, where I uploaded the video onto my laptop and sat on the couch to watch. The first few hours of footage were uneventful and showed nothing, which only added to my mounting dread. At around midnight, something could be heard shuffling awkwardly up the stairs. By the time it reached the hall, I was shaking, and I'd nearly bitten through the bottom of my lip. Very, very slowly, Charlotte's door squeaked open, and the most horrifying thing I have ever seen entered into my sister's room. It was a woman, a naked woman, who looked like nearly every bone in her body had been broken and then reset by the most incompetent doctors. She crab-walked on limbs bent sharply at bizarre angles, and her chest caved in as if she was missing whole sections of her ribs. Her spine and shoulders curved inward, forming a camel-like bump on the back and pushing her head down between her breasts. And the sounds she was making. Oh God, it was a deep, raspy, guttural noise, caught somewhere between a moan and a gasp, and it made me want to claw my own ears off. She shuffled right up to Charlotte's bed and sat there for a while, as if not sure what to do next. Then, slowly, she began to turn her head, neck cracking loudly with the movement. Her long, stringy hair fell back as she looked right at the camera. Her face, to put it mildly, was grotesque. The skin was so taut I could see every contour of her skull and facial bones, and her eyes were rolled all the way back in her head, stark white. She had no visible lips, and her nose seemed to be caving in. I slammed the laptop shut and ran upstairs. After searching Charlotte's room and finding no sign of the monstrosity I'd just seen, I grabbed my still sleeping sister and fled to my best friend's house. I was in shock. I couldn't quite process what had just happened. That was 3 years ago. Charlotte hadn't seen the Twisted Lady in a long time, and I never showed my parents the footage. In fact, I deleted it. I didn't want what I'd seen to be real. But now I'm not so sure I made the right choice. You see, a month ago, my father was doing some homework in the basement when he discovered that some bricks in the wall had come loose. Further investigation revealed a makeshift grave where a broken human skeleton lay. The police haven't been able to identify the victim, but I know she's connected to the Twisted Lady. Since the discovery, past owners of the house have come forward and admitted to seeing her too. None of them imagined she was a possible murder victim. Then again, neither did my family. Looking back, I believe the Twisted Lady only wanted help. She wanted to tell someone who she was and what had happened to her, but she was unable to convey any of this. If I hadn't been such a coward and gotten rid of the footage, maybe her bones could have been discovered sooner. I hope they catch her killer, so that the sick bastard can be brought to justice. And I hope once he's been brought to justice, the Twisted Lady can finally be at peace. I've lived in the same small, dreary Nebraska town my entire life. I'm not a hick, like most people that don't live in Nebraska assume, and we're not backward people either. We have running water, electricity, all that good stuff. Sure, sometimes we had an and wash, but otherwise we're exactly like everyone else. But I digress. About a 2-hour drive from my hometown, there lies Seven Sisters Road. Seven Sisters Road is one of the most popular ghost stories to be told around where I live. I remember my grandfather giving me and my sister the drunken version of the story every Saturday night. I would sit on the edge of my seat while he spouted beer-fueled nonsense about the road, fascinated by what my little 18-year-old mind could piece together. And I made it my life goal to get to go down that road one day and see if the legends were true. The Seven Sisters Road, for those that don't know, is a sketchy, unmaintained stretch of road a few miles out of Nebraska City. Nebraska is no stranger to gruesome tales. We have the Witch's Bridge, the Ammunitions Depot in my hometown, among others. But this has always stood out. This is by far the most blood-curdling piece of folklore this state has to offer. It starts with a man, as most of these tales do. He lived in this stretch of road with 7 daughters, and one day for some unknown reason, he went completely bonkers and killed every last one of them. He lured them out of the house, one by one, leading each one to a separate hill, and there he hung them from the trees. Driving down the road can be dangerous. Cars will stall, headlights will dim, and phone batteries will die without warning. Perhaps the most chilling is hearing the screams of the 7 sisters. And all of that was merely a ghost story, something I may have believed when I was 8 or 9, but quickly passed off as a side effect of my grandpa's rampant alcoholism. I started doing more research, but finding things out about Nebraska is damn near impossible, because really, who cares about the state that gifted us with Kool-Aid? All I could find were 2 websites explaining the legend in the exact same way, and a newspaper article about a new road plan. No mention on if the murders actually happened. Nothing. So I got ready to go head out and keep my promise to my 8-year-old self. I was going to Seven Sisters Road. I armed myself with my car keys and my emergency backpack, picked up my best friend, and we were off. An hour and a half, 2 hours maybe, saw us on the outskirts of Nebraska City. We stopped in town to fuel up, grabbed some snacks, and headed back out. It was near dusk when we found the road. It's technically called Road L now, and I pulled onto the unpaved mess, my heart thrumming in my chest. A quarter mile down the road, and nothing had happened yet. I wanted to laugh it off, but being a lover of the paranormal, and also a bit of a skeptic, I couldn't. Not this time. I needed proof that this road was going to stall my car or kill my phone, and I needed it bad. We passed the first hill, and still nothing but a rapidly beating heart and anxiety. My best friend scrolled through her phone, unfazed and bored as ever.
"Honestly, we should turn back. Nothing's going to happen,"
she said. I shook my head and kept driving. We passed the second hill, and my car let out a groan. did you hear that?" I asked, turning to my friend. She rolled her eyes.
Okay, yes, but literally, your car always makes weird noises. That didn't prove anything.
Smartass. I didn't say anything for a minute, until my headlights flickered.
Hey, did you see that?
I pointed excitedly.
I did.
My friend's face had gone white.
What's up? You look sick.
I reached down to the cup holder and handed her a bottle of water.
Dude, my phone is dead. I had half a charge.
She croaked after taking a sip of water. I laughed, giddy with that delight that we were actually getting results from the trip. After visiting most of the so-called paranormal locations in this boring-ass state, we were finally getting somewhere. "This is amazing!" I shouted. We were somewhere past the 4th or 5th hill, the sun finally having gone down. The pink streaks in the fluffy clouds were completely gone, leaving darkness in their wake. It wasn't till we passed the 6th hill that the screaming started, and my blood ran cold. Now, the legend always recounted that it was the sisters that could be heard screaming, never the father. But the screams I now heard were definitely male. I could hear distinctly female screams too, but they were always answered by a deep, masculine voice that turned my blood to ice.
We need to go.
My friend stated plainly, her voice deadpan, her white moon of a face illuminated by my dashboard lights. I nodded. The male voice sounded so much closer than the screaming sisters. They sounded as though they were coming from the inside of the car itself, and I willed myself not to turn around and check the back seat, scared of what I might find. I swallowed painfully, my car rocking and rumbling its way down the road until we passed the 7th hill, and everything stopped. The road was still unpaved, but oddly maintained. My headlights weren't flickering, but most importantly, there was a dead silence. There wasn't a single scream to be heard. My friend and I let out a simultaneous sigh of relief. There was no way in hell I was going back through that road to get back to Nebraska City. Nobody could pay me enough to do so. I don't know what made it worse though. The fact that the screaming male voice sounded close enough to be in my backseat, or the fact that we could have been stranded and nobody would have known. But I do know one thing. Seven Sisters Road is definitely not some crackpot drunk's fictitious ramblings. If you decide to make the trek out here, please be careful. Carry a map instead of GPS for God's sake, and always bring at least one more person. You never know what could happen. I Think I Died 17 Years Ago by Lil Dodesy. I think I died 17 years ago. Specifically, I think I died on 9/11/2001. No, not in the hell that was the terrorist attacks, but from something not entirely unrelated. See, I was born in Gander, Newfoundland. Yes, that Gander, from the play. Even though people call the town heroes or whatever, as a child at the time, 9/11 wasn't about terrorist attacks. It was about extended summer. See, Gander allowed thousands and thousands of people whose flights were canceled to stay in our town. Our schools were closed to house people. Our homes were opened to take people. Our churches and community center were packed with rows and rows of beds. Our small town of 10,000, more than doubled overnight. But me, I was turning 9. My birthday was 9/10, so when school was closed the next day, it felt like God himself gave me a birthday present. At that point, we were given summer again, and there was only one thing to do: gather up my friends and go play. Now, when I was young, we would always play at the old town site, an abandoned military town that sat next to the airport, right next to the runway. It was from there that the town sprang up. But for us, it was a vast expanse of woods to run around in, safe because of the heightened airport security and the turkey farm. It wasn't a turkey farm, but rather a military base of the top secret variety, but whose stories are for another day, with the occasional ruined building to explore. It was in one of those buildings that I think I died. In Gander, there is one ghost story that everybody knows, and that is, if you see a white rabbit out of season at the old town site, don't turn around. As the story goes, when the old town was still inhabited, a woman was murdered. The reason changes with each telling. Sometimes she cheated, sometimes she was a daughter, sometimes she was a witch, but everyone agrees on how she died. She was dismembered, both arms and both legs, had her eyes carved out, and the whole lot of her body dumped in the town well. The next day when the people found her, the well was surrounded by snow-white rabbits, even though it was out of season. So if you see a snow-white rabbit out of season, then she's right behind you. Well, while we were playing manhunt, hide and seek crossed with football, I decided to hide in one of the buildings. Flynn's house, this one was called, because on the ground floor there was an underground cellar that you could crawl into, and our town vagabond, Tracy Flynn, would often stay there in the winter. However, it was summer, and that meant it would be empty. So I crawled in, and though it was dark, it was perfect for hiding. I hunkered down and waited, for how long, who knows. Time was so different back then, before cell phones and the restlessness of childhood. Until eventually, a snow-white rabbit hopped down the crawl space and stopped directly in front of me. My blood froze and my heart rate skyrocketed, and suddenly I could feel eyes burning into me from behind. I can't say if it was panic from the stories setting in or an actual phenomena, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to leave. I knew she was right behind me. Slowly, I crawled out from the cellar into the light, and slowly I exited the house. I began to slowly walk home, but I had that feeling behind me, that creeping feeling of dread, that barely suppressed terror that makes you want to vomit, and yet incapable of it all at once. I tried to ignore it. I walked for several minutes, or hours for all I know. I could feel it. I remember hearing footsteps, but I'm sure at the time there were none. I remember hearing faint dripping, but I'm certain there was none. It was useless in the end, though. I had to look. I couldn't head home without checking, and I regret that to this day. She was behind me. She stood nonsensically on missing legs, arms that weren't there outstretched towards me, empty eye sockets bleeding, staring directly at me. Yellowed teeth behind black and cracked lips sneered hatefully. Her naked, gray, bloated body was waterlogged and bruised, and the smell that came out of nowhere was overpowering. But it wasn't the smell of rot. It was something else. Something unlike anything I had ever come across before, but now I knew to be stagnant water. Most of all, I remember she could see me. She was staring directly at me, her eye holes burning into the back of my retina. And she hated me. So I ran. I sprinted, faster than I had ever run, farther than I could ever run. I sprinted down the road by the runway, down past the recycling plant, past the graveyard, past where they were building a new Walmart, all the way to my home. There, I shut myself in my room and waited, catatonic. It wasn't until recently that I realized all the weirdness that followed. My friends that day never came looking for me, and when we next spoke, they were distant and strange. Eventually, they all drifted from me. My parents checked in less, and I spent much of my time alone. My grades slipped. I developed paranoia and the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to traumatic experiences and being a loner, so I just went on in a haze. But that whole sprint lasted nearly 40 minutes, and I wasn't even winded. More than that, I always loved company. Being a loner was new and different. I ate when I was supposed to, and slept when I was supposed to. But I can honestly say I was never hungry or tired, just living on autopilot. Last week, I tried not eating to see if it was all in my head, to see if I was simply misremembering. I have never felt a hunger pang since. I tried the same with sleep, and I'm still awake. I spent a whole night at the gym and never tired or shed any sweat, no matter what I did. Now here I am, not sure if I'm alive or dead. I exist. I can talk to people. I work, but I can't connect to anyone. Food and sleep are apparently optional. I have no relationships. I don't remember anybody, and I don't think they remember me. So I'm trying here, online, somewhere where I will be believed. You who read this, do you know me? Worst of all is the realization that since that day 17 years ago, I have never looked over my shoulder. And I can't. I know she's still there. Someone Lives in My House by Mrs. Rice 818. So, with the nagging of my fiancé, I've decided to post this story here. It's probably one of the scariest things that has happened to me during my 40 years on this planet. I live with my fiancé and my younger brother, who works in law enforcement. This will be semi-relevant to the story, in a smallish town outside Las Vegas. We don't have much crime for being close to Vegas, but we do have some, and we have no shortage of tweakers and a growing population of homeless folk. Last summer, I was in between jobs and spent a good deal of time at the public library or my father's business office using the free Wi-Fi to browse jobs. It was around 4 in the afternoon when I returned home. We have a dog named Suki. She's a bull terrier, cattle dog mix. She's wary of strangers and a literal terrorist, so it makes her the perfect watchdog. Anyway, it's hot, as I live in Satan's butthole, and I was sweating profusely, so I ran a tepid bath, turned on Spotify, grabbed a magazine, and locked myself in the bathroom. Doggo is outside the bathroom door, whining because the big idiot hates water, but likes dropping her toys in the water. Anyway, I'm mid-bath, and I hear my dog losing it. Then I hear her run upstairs, and I heard someone go, "Oh crap." I froze. I was naked as a jaybird, and I had no weapons. My brother's lockbox with his Glock was upstairs, and my dog was upstairs, fighting off what I assumed to be an intruder. I grabbed my phone as I heard the intruder yelling at my dog, who was, I'm sure, tearing into him. I dialed 911 and screamed that I was going to call the cops. That cued him cursing, and I'm sure trying to pry 55 pounds of my crazy dog off of him. Somehow he got away and ran out the back door. My dog tore after him, and as I was talking to the dispatcher, I threw on some clothes, then ran up the stairs. My dog came back inside, prouder than anything and strutting around. I locked her in my brother's bedroom as the cops showed up, as I didn't need her biting one of them. Apparently, my neighbor heard the barking and caught the guy. He's 125 pounds, soaking wet, no shirt, and covered in dog bites and meth scars. Apparently, he found our fake rock, in which we hid a key, and then let himself inside. He was taken off. Cops told me not to use a fake rock again. Well, no crap. I figured that one out. Doggo was fed a delicious steak, and I spent the next few weeks terrified some tweakers were going to break back in. We now keep 2 guns locked up, one upstairs and one downstairs. Himself inside. He was taken off. Cops told me not to use a fake rock again. Well, no crap. I figured that one out. Doggo was fed a delicious steak, and I spent the next few weeks terrified some tweakers were going to break back in. We now keep 2 guns locked up, one upstairs and one downstairs. I am currently sitting in front of my computer, scared witless. Every moment could be my last. My friend is here with me, and he is the sole reason why my life is in danger. It may not make sense at first, but let me explain. It all started earlier today when a friend of mine burst into my house and slammed the door behind him. His eyes were wide with fear, and he stood there with his back against the door, breathing heavily. I asked him what had happened, and he told me this story. He had been living with his aunt for the past year because his parents were in Mexico. They were doing mission work at a small hospital in southern Mexico. The previous night, a bedraggled man had stumbled through the entrance of the hospital. He was screaming in Spanish and appeared to be out of his mind with terror. They brought him over to a chair and let him sit down. As he caught his breath, he told his story in broken English. He claimed his sister had been killed by something he referred to as La Muerto Blanco. He kept saying that it was coming for him next. Confused, they asked him what a Muerto Blanco was. With a look of unfathomable fear on his face, he said that La Muerto Blanco was the White Death. She is the soul of a girl who died years ago. She died by her own hand, he said, alone and unloved. She hated life so much that she wanted to remove all traces of herself from the earth. So great was her desire to completely obliterate her memory that she returned from the dead as a vengeful spirit, bent on killing all those who knew of her existence. "She is a girl, but not a girl," he said. "She's not dead, but not really alive. She has cold, black eyes that weep blood. She walks without ever actually seeming to move an inch. She stalks her victims like a wild animal, pursuing them across rivers and valleys, trailing them back to their homes. You are never really aware that she is following you until you hear her telltale knock upon your door. She knocks once for your skin, which she'll use to patch her own decaying flesh. Twice for your hair, which she'll gnash between her teeth. 3 times for your bones, which she'll fashion into clubs. 4 times for your heart, which she'll tear out of your chest. 5 times for your teeth, which she'll polish and keep in a box. 6 times for your eyes, which she'll pluck out one by one. And 7 times for your soul, which she'll swallow whole. No matter where you go, the White Death will track you down and you will hear her terrible knocking begin on the door. You can try to outrun her, but she's faster than any mortal man. If you flee from your home while she is knocking on your door, she will just follow you wherever you go." The terrified man was certain that this thing had killed his sister. He tried to tell the police about the White Death, but they would not listen, dismissing it as an old wives' tale. Next, he tried to tell his priest, but the priest immediately shut the door of the church in his face and turned him away. The priest had seen the White Death following him, he said, and did not want to get involved. With his head in his hands, the frightened man said that the White Death follows you forever until you tell someone else about it. Then it strikes. It kills you and begins following the person you told. After finishing his tale, the man stole a car from the mission hospital parking lot and vanished into the night. Apparently, my friend's mother and father had immediately called his aunt and told her about the strange man they had encountered. They asked her if she had ever heard of the White Death. She said she had not, and they proceeded to tell her the story that the man had told them. The aunt got a phone call later that night. It was the Mexican police. They told her that the parents had been found dead outside the hospital. They had been torn apart. My friend's aunt had immediately called him at school to break the bad news to him. As he cried, she told him she could not understand what had happened. She recounted the whole story to him, telling him about the strange man who had turned up in the hospital just hours before the parents were found dead. She told him even how the man had given his parents a weird and disturbing story about something called the White Death. When he hung up the phone, he struggled to come to terms with what had happened. It almost didn't seem real to him. When he got home after school, he found the front door of his aunt's house standing open. Inside was a trail of blood leading into the kitchen. There, on the kitchen floor, he found his aunt's dead body. She had been torn limb from limb. He ran out of the house all the way across town, never looking back until he reached my house. As he told me this story, I could hardly believe it. Within the space of a day, his mother, his father, and his aunt had all been murdered. It seemed too far-fetched. But before I could utter a word, my friend and I both recoiled in horror as we heard a knocking begin at my front door. We've been staring at the door for an hour now, neither of us wanting to open it. The knocking is still going on, growing louder and louder. She never gives up. She never quits. La Muerto Blanco is unstoppable. I think she wants to scare us, my friend and I. I think she wants us to blame each other. And I do. I blame my friend. It's all his fault. He should have never have told about her. As I sit here in my house beside my friend, both of us listening to that hideous knocking growing ever louder, I wish a lot of things. I wish he had killed my friend before he reached my house. If he had never been able to tell me about her, I wouldn't be in danger now. I'm sorry I ever met him. And I'm sorry for you too. I'm sorry I've made you read this story. I'm sorry I ever told you about the White Death. Because now that you know about her, she'll be coming for you next.